April 18, 1945. A stone cellar in Bavaria. A German officer sits in the dark with 6 loaded sidearms on the floor in front of him, and he refuses to move. Not because he's wounded, not because he's confused, but because the American soldier pointing a rifle at his chest is Jewish. And in the dying mind of the Third Reich, that was still enough of a reason to die on your feet, rather than live on your knees before the wrong kind of man. 12 days from now, Adolf Hitler will be dead. The war in Europe has 3 weeks left to breathe. And in this cellar, with the smell of burnt timber hanging over a half-destroyed Bavarian village, one moment is about to happen that the official record will never mention until a woman donates a private letter to a university archive nearly 60 years later. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past, the ones the textbooks quietly left out. My name is David Levine. He was 23 years old, a math student from Brooklyn who worked a dry goods counter on Sutter Avenue. Not a general, not a decorated commander, a corporal. And today, we're going to watch a colonel from Augusta, Georgia, a man who grew up inside America's own hierarchy of race, walk into a burning cellar and make the Third Reich eat its last insult whole. This is what happened. Every word of it is real. By the spring of 1945, the German military had entered a state that historians have since called organized collapse. American armored columns were punching southeast through Bavaria at a speed that left entire Wehrmacht formations marooned behind the advancing line like islands at high tide. In a single week, the week of April 14th through April 21st, American forces processed over 300,000 German prisoners in the European theater. Entire divisions surrendered, not in climactic battle, but in farmhouses, barns, road ditches, and cellars, hands raised, eyes blank. The ideology drained out of them by 3 years of Eastern Front attrition and 2 years of Allied bombing. But here is what the casualty figures and the prisoner counts don't tell you. The ideology did not die evenly. It did not evaporate the moment a rifle appeared in a doorway. In the rear areas, in the security battalions and administrative commands that had spent the last year insulated from the real scale of the German collapse, old convictions had calcified into something almost geological. The men in those units had spent 12 years inside a system that told them certain categories of human beings were beneath them. And that system does not dissolve in 3 weeks just because the Eastern Front has caved in. What was happening in Bavaria in April 1945 was not simply a military surrender. It was the collision of 2 entirely different understandings of what a human being is worth. And in a stone cellar on the eastern edge of Waldmünchen, that collision was about to become extremely personal. The village of Waldmünchen sits in the Upper Palatinate, close to the Czech border, in a region of dark pine forest and limestone ridges that held winter cold well into spring. By April 18th, the village had been shelled twice in 8 days. Several buildings were burning or had already burned. The Wehrmacht units in the area had fragmented, some trying to reach the Czech border, some simply waiting in place for someone to come and tell them it was over. It was by every measure the end of something. But endings, as any soldier will tell you, are the most dangerous part of any war, because the men inside them don't yet know they're in one. Corporal David Levine was 23 years old. He had grown up in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, in a household that understood what it meant to start over. His parents had come through Ellis Island in 1921, 2 Polish Jewish immigrants with $40 one leather suitcase, and a city that didn't particularly want them. His father had built a dry goods store on Sutter Avenue through a combination of precision and stubbornness that David had inherited without realizing it. Before the war, David was working the store counter during the day and attending night classes in mathematics at Brooklyn College. He was quiet in the way that people become when they have watched their parents rebuild a life from nothing and understood at some cellular level that nothing is given, everything is maintained. He noticed details. He was careful with language. He did not waste words or movements or, as it turned out, bullets. He enlisted in September 1942, 9 months after Pearl Harbor, when the country's initial shock had curdled into the specific grinding determination of a nation that had made up its mind. He went through North Africa. He went up the Italian peninsula in the mud and the cold in a campaign that the American press covered far less than Normandy, and that cost far more than people remember. He crossed into Germany in the final weeks of the war as part of a unit pushing southeast through Bavaria, and he carried with him a silver star he never talked about, earned at the Rapido River crossing in January 1944, during a night that cost his company 41 men. His hands were steady. His voice was even. He had seen enough to know the war was almost finished, and he intended to be breathing when it was. On the afternoon of April 18th, Levine was leading a three-man patrol through the outskirts of Waldmünchen when they identified a stone farmhouse on the eastern edge of the village with signs of recent occupation. Standard procedure. They cleared the upper floors, found evidence of hasty departure, and then Levine took the cellar stairs himself, with his M1 Garand leveled and his flashlight cutting through the dark. 6 German officers, sitting against the stone wall, their sidearms already on the floor in front of them, a deliberate signal of non-resistance. Their faces tired and careful and small in the flashlight beam. Levine had picked up serviceable German over 2 years of combat. Not textbook German, but functional German. The German of commands and interrogations, and the specific vocabulary of men telling each other where to go and what to do. He gave the order clearly. Get up. Hands visible. Single file to the stairs. 5 of the 6 men moved immediately. Slowly, carefully, with the precise compliance of men who have made the calculation and accepted the outcome. The 6th man did not move. Oberleutnant Heinrich Brandt was 42 years old. He was a career Wehrmacht officer from a Munich military family with 4 generations of service, the kind of man for whom the German officer's uniform was not a job but an identity, so deeply worn it had fused to the skin. He was tall, correctly postured, close-cropped gray at his temples. He had served in Poland and France in the opening months of the Eastern Campaign. He had spent the last year commanding a rear area security battalion that had seen almost no serious combat. How as a man who had lived his entire adult life inside a system that told him certain men were his inferiors, by nature, by blood, by the organizing logic of civilization as he understood it. He had not accepted this with particular cruelty. He had accepted it the way you accept the temperature of the room you were born in, without ever noticing that acceptance was even occurring. And now he was sitting in a cellar with a rifle pointed at him, and the man holding it was Jewish. He could see the Star of David on the chain at Levine's collar. He could read the face in front of him. And something in Brandt, something 12 years in the making, something that the entire collapsing structure of the Reich could not dislodge in a single afternoon, simply refused. He looked at Levine for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I will not surrender to you," Brandt said. "Bring me an officer." Levine kept the rifle steady. His voice was flat. "I am the ranking man in this room. You are my prisoner." Brandt looked at the uniform, looked at the chain. His expression did not change. "I know what you are," he said, "and I will not place myself in the custody of someone like you. Bring me an Aryan officer, or I will not move from this floor." The 4 other German officers in the cellar stared at their boots, as if the floor had become the most interesting thing any of them had ever seen. Levine stood there for a moment. Then he made a decision that would define the next hour more completely than any choice he made with his rifle. He sent the 5 compliant prisoners up the stairs under guard, and then he stood alone in the cold dark with Heinrich Brandt and told him one more time to get up. Brandt crossed his arms and waited. Corporal Levine did not shoot him. He did not strike him. He climbed the stairs and sent a runner for his commanding officer, and then he stood outside in the pale Bavarian sunlight and waited with the steadiness of a man who had crossed the Rapido River in the dark and come out the other side. Colonel James Whitfield arrived at the farmhouse 20 minutes later. 37 years old. Career infantry officer. Augusta, Georgia. A hard-edged, pragmatic man who had commanded his battalion from Tunisia to the German border without a single newspaper interview and no particular interest in acquiring one. He was not given to speeches. He was not sentimental about the war or about himself. He had grown up in the segregated South. He carried the specific and complicated weight of that upbringing with him. Everywhere he went, the way you carry a stone in your boot. You don't stop walking, but you always know it's there. He had fought alongside black American soldiers in Italy and learned what they were capable of. And whatever he believed in the private rooms of his own mind, he had learned over 3 years of combat that the only hierarchy that mattered in the field was the one you earned in the dirt. When Levine reported what had happened in the cellar flat, voice, still face, every detail in sequence, Whitfield listened without expression. Then he walked down the stairs himself. Brant looked up when he saw the oak leaf clusters in the flashlight beam, and the relief on his face was immediate and visible. He began to speak. He explained that he had no objection to American authority, that he was fully prepared to surrender, that he simply required the dignity of surrendering to a proper officer. Surely the colonel understood. Surely this was a reasonable request. Surely Whitfield let him finish. Then he turned around, walked back up the stairs, and called Levine down into the cellar. He positioned the corporal directly in front of the prisoner. Then he turned to Brant, and when he spoke, his voice carried no heat at all, which made it considerably more frightening than shouting. "This soldier found you," Whitfield said. "This soldier ordered you to surrender, and you refused. This soldier has fought in 3 countries and bled for this army while you were sitting on a stone floor. You will surrender to Corporal Levine. You will hand him your officer's identification. You will state clearly that you are surrendering yourself and your rank to his custody. And if you do not, I will note in my official report that you actively resisted capture, which carries consequences. I imagine you would prefer to avoid at this particular moment in the war." Brant opened his mouth once, then closed it. He looked at Levine standing in the flashlight beam, rifle at rest, expression unreadable. The patience of a man who had already waded through things that made this cellar look comfortable. And something in the Oberleutnant, the part of him that had survived 4 years of actual war by being practical when it mattered, recognized that there was no move left on the board. He stood up slowly from the stone floor, reached into his breast pocket, held out his identification booklet with both hands. Levine took it. "I surrender to your custody," Brant said. His voice was stripped of everything it had contained an hour before. Levine accepted the document, marked the time in his field notebook, and walked Heinrich Brandt up the cellar stairs and out into the pale Bavarian sunlight. Neither man said another word. Whitfield never mentioned the cellar in his official after-action report. He filed a routine prisoner capture, 6 German officers, no resistance. He did not explain the gap. He did write about it once in a private letter to his wife in Augusta. He wrote that he had done it not because it was regulation, and not because he was a particularly righteous man. He wrote that he was tired. Tired of watching the world hand dignity to people who hadn't earned it and withhold it from people who had. He wrote that Levine hadn't needed anyone to fight his battle for him. What the corporal needed was for the record to be correct. His wife kept the letter. Their daughter donated it to a university archive in 2003. That is how we know this happened. David Levine came home to Brooklyn in August 1945. He finished his mathematics degree, earned a teaching certificate, and spent 31 years teaching high school mathematics in East New York. Precise, patient, completely unwilling to pass a student who had not genuinely earned it. He retired in 1979. He never spoke publicly about the war. His silver star was in a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet when his daughter found it after he died in 2001, still in the original leather case, never once displayed. Heinrich Brandt was processed through an Allied POW facility near Regensburg and held until June 1945. A denazification tribunal that autumn classified him as a follower, the second lowest category, assessed a fine and barred him from public office for 4 years. He returned to Munich and worked as a municipal records clerk until his retirement in 1968. In 1981, he gave one interview to a West German documentary filmmaker. When asked if there was anything he wished he had done differently, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had been wrong about certain things, and that the wrong had been his, and that he had known it the moment the American corporal walked him up those stairs and out into the light without a single word of triumph. He died in Munich in 1989, the same year the wall came down. Some military historians have argued that what Whitfield did in that cellar was strategically meaningless, a personal gesture in a corner of a war that was already decided. They are correct that it changed nothing about the operational picture. They are correct that 6 German officers in a Bavarian cellar were not going to alter the outcome of the Second World War. But there is another argument, and it is the one that the letter in the university archive makes quietly and without drama, which is that the moments of record matter precisely because they happen inside systems that are otherwise indifferent to them. That what Whitfield did was insist that the war's outcome include a specific truth that would otherwise have been quietly erased. That David Levine walked out of that cellar with a German officer's identification in his field notebook, and that this fact existed, and that it was correct. 12 days later, Adolf Hitler was dead in a Berlin bunker. 3 weeks after that, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. But here is the question that Whitfield's letter doesn't answer, and that no archive can fully resolve. In the thousands of similar moments happening simultaneously across Bavaria, across Germany, across the dying geography of the Third Reich, how many of them went the other way? How many American officers confronted with the same situation took the surrender themselves and walked away and said nothing? How many David Levines were quietly erased from the record, not by malice, but by the simple human preference for convenience over correction? We don't know. We can't know. What we know is this one cellar, this one afternoon, this one colonel who was tired of the wrong thing winning on a technicality. In Part 2, we go deeper into the machinery that made Brandt possible, into the specific history of what the Third Reich built into its officer corps over 12 years, and into the question of how a system teaches an entire generation of men to refuse a human being's authority based solely on what they are. And we'll look at what the denazification process actually accomplished, and what it quietly left untouched. Stay with us, because the story of that cellar is not finished yet. In a stone cellar in Bavaria, on April 18, 1945, a 23-year-old corporal from Brooklyn pointed a rifle at a German officer who refused to surrender, not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. Not to someone like that, not to someone like David Levine. And Colonel James Whitfield walked down those stairs, listened to the insult, walked back up, and then did something that no regulation required, and no superior officer would ever know about. He handed the moment back to the man it belonged to. Brandt surrendered. Levine took the document. The war had 12 days left. But here is what we didn't answer in Part 1. Here is the question that the letter in the archive leaves open like a wound. Whitfield was one colonel, one man who made one decision in one cellar. Across Bavaria, in April 1945, there were thousands of cellars, thousands of moments exactly like that one. And the institution that Whitfield served, the United States Army, had spent the previous 3 years building its own architecture of who counted and who didn't. In 1945, the U.S. Army was still officially segregated. Black American soldiers fought in separate units. Jewish soldiers were documented in ways that made them identifiable to the enemy if captured. And the formal protocols for prisoner surrender contained no language, none, about what happened when a captured officer refused to comply based on the identity of his captor. The system had not prepared for David Levine. It had not prepared for the possibility that the man with the rifle might be someone the enemy considered subhuman. And that gap, that silence in the regulations, was about to become a problem that went far beyond one cellar involvement. 3 days after Brandt's capture, Levine's battalion commander, Major Gerald Voss, received an informal inquiry from a Wehrmacht liaison officer being processed at the Regensburg facility. The inquiry was polite, bureaucratic, and absolutely serious. It asked whether American policy permitted Jewish soldiers to take formal custody of German officers, and if so, whether those officers had any recourse under the Geneva Conventions. Voss took the inquiry up the chain. And here is where the story stops being about one corporal and starts being about something larger and considerably uglier. Brigadier General Thomas Cavanaugh received the inquiry on April 21, 1945. He was 51 years old, a West Point man from the class of 1916, a career officer who had spent the last 3 years in theater logistics and administrative command. He had not seen serious combat since France in 1918. He was not a cruel man. He was something more dangerous than cruel. He was a man who believed absolutely in the authority of process, in the sanctity of established procedure, in the idea that the way things had always been done was the way things should continue to be done, because the alternative was chaos. He called Foss into his office on the morning of April 22nd. Levine's name was on the table between them in a typed report. This soldier took a formal surrender from a Wehrmacht Oberleutnant, Kavanaugh said. There is now a written inquiry suggesting this may create a legal complication in the prisoner processing pipeline. Foss kept his voice level. The corporal followed correct procedure, sir. The prisoner initially refused. Colonel Whitfield was called. He resolved the situation. Whitfield resolved it in a way that is now generating paperwork at Regensburg, Kavanaugh said. I need that paperwork to stop. With respect, General, the paperwork stops when the German army accepts that its officers don't get to choose who captures them. Kavanaugh looked at him for a long moment. I'm not relitigating the German army's preferences, Major. I'm telling you that this situation has created an administrative complication, and I need it managed, quietly, before it reaches Schaeff. Foss understood what was being asked. Not a direct order. Not a formal directive. A suggestion weighted with the full authority of rank that the path of least resistance was to quietly reassign Levine, reclassify the prisoner capture, and allow Brandt's inquiry to die in a filing drawer somewhere in Regensburg. He went back to his unit. He said nothing to Levine. And then he did something that cost him professionally for the next 4 years. He put the entire sequence of events in writing in a formal memorandum addressed to Colonel Whitfield, with a copy routed to the Judge Advocate General's office. Whitfield read the memorandum in less than 5 minutes. Then he picked up a field telephone and made a call. And here is where the story acquires its unexpected ally. Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Estrin was not the kind of person Whitfield would have sought out under normal circumstances. She was 34 years old, one of the Army's small number of female officers serving in theater with the Women's Army Corps attached to the JAG office that Foss had copied on his memorandum. She had a law degree from Columbia, 3 years of military legal experience, and the specific finely calibrated patience of a woman who had spent her entire professional life being told her opinion was optional. She had read Foss's memorandum within an hour of its arrival. When Whitfield reached her by phone, she had already pulled the relevant sections of the Geneva Conventions, the Army's existing prisoner processing regulations, and every precedent she could locate for prisoner refusal situations. She spoke for approximately 4 minutes without interruption. Then she said, "There is no legal basis for Brandt's inquiry. None. The conventions do not grant a prisoner the right to select his captor based on race or religion. The inquiry should be rejected formally and in writing, and the original capture record should stand exactly as filed." "That's what I thought," Whitfield said. "The problem," Estrin said, "is that General Kavanaugh doesn't want a formal rejection. He wants the inquiry to disappear. And if you push a formal rejection up to his level, he's going to push back, and it's going to become a question of whose career can absorb the friction." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend we don't give him the option to push back," she said. "I recommend the formal rejection is drafted at JAG level, routed directly to Regensburg, and copied to 3 other offices simultaneously, including the Inspector General. At that point, making it disappear becomes considerably more complicated than letting it stand." That is exactly what happened. The rejection was filed on April 24, 1945. Brandt's inquiry was denied on legal grounds in a document that cited the Geneva Conventions by article and clause. The denial was copied to 4 offices. General Kavanaugh received his copy and did nothing because there was nothing left to do. The record was already in 4 places simultaneously. The test, if you could call it that, was the document itself. The formal legal denial signed, dated, filed in triplicate. But there was a second test that no one had anticipated. On April 26, 1945. 8 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. A similar situation occurred at a processing facility near Nuremberg. A Wehrmacht major refused to complete his intake paperwork when he discovered that the processing officer was a black American lieutenant named Calvin Morris from Detroit, Michigan, 26 years old, who had been handling prisoner intake for 6 weeks without incident. This time, the refusing officer was informed by the facility commander, a man who had been quietly briefed on the Regensburg rejection, that his refusal constituted non-cooperation under military law, that it was being documented in his prisoner file, and that it would be reviewed by the denazification board processing his case. The major completed his paperwork within 10 minutes. The facility commander's name does not appear in any historical account of the final weeks of the war in Bavaria. He was following a precedent that had been established 4 days earlier in a JAG office by a woman whose name also appears in no historical account. And he was following it because someone had bothered to put the correct version of events in writing in a form that could be copied and distributed and used again. This is what institutions actually run on. Not heroism, not individual acts of courage in stone cellars. Those matter, they matter enormously, but they matter precisely because they generate the paperwork, the precedents, the formal records that either get filed correctly or get made to disappear. Whitfield's decision in the cellar was the act. Estrin's memorandum was the mechanism that prevented the act from being reversed. By early May 1945, as Germany moved toward its final surrender, the JAG office had distributed informal guidance to processing facilities across Bavaria and the Rhineland on handling prisoner refusals based on captor identity. The guidance was not glamorous. It was 3 paragraphs of dense legal language with citations. But it traveled through the administrative pipeline of an army that processed hundreds of thousands of prisoners in those final weeks. And it meant that when the next Brandt sat in the next cellar and decided that his ideology was still operational, someone in the room already had the answer. The resistance did not stop. There were other refusals, there were other inquiries, there were other officers like Kavanaugh who preferred administrative convenience to administrative justice. What changed was that the people on the receiving end of those refusals now had a document. They had a precedent. They had the record correct in writing in 4 places at once. David Levine never knew about the memorandum. He never knew about the phone call between Whitfield and Estrin. He never knew that his capture of Heinrich Brandt had generated a legal document that traveled through the Army's administrative system and landed in processing facilities across 2 countries. He was a corporal. He was busy with the end of a war. What he knew was that on April 18, 1945, he had walked a German officer up a cellar staircase in the pale Bavarian sunlight, and the officer had handed him his identification with both hands and said the correct words, and the record was correct, and that was enough. But here is what no one anticipated. Here is the complication that neither Whitfield nor Estrin nor Foss had built into their calculations. The denazification tribunal that processed Heinrich Brandt that autumn, the tribunal that classified him as a follower and assessed him a fine and sent him back to Munich, received his prisoner file, the complete file, including the original capture record, the refusal documentation, and the JAG denial. The tribunal used it. They used the refusal as evidence of ideological commitment that extended past the point of German military collapse. They argued successfully that a man who invoked racial hierarchy while sitting in a cellar with a rifle pointed at him was not a passive follower of National Socialism. He was an active believer who continued to believe when belief had become personally dangerous. His classification was debated for 3 sessions. He was ultimately still classified as a follower. The board was not inclined to go further without more direct evidence of criminal acts. But the fine was larger than it otherwise would have been. And the bar on public office lasted 4 years instead of 2. Because of a field notebook entry. Because of a timestamp. Because of one corporal who marked the correct information in the correct place, and one colonel who made sure it stayed there. The wall came down in 1989. Brandt died that year. We do not know if he watched it fall. In Part 3, we go to the place. The official histories never reach into the specific files that the denazification process left open deliberately or otherwise, and into the question of what happened to the men who were classified as followers and returned to German public life, and whether the system that Whitfield and Estrin built their 3-paragraph guidance document to resist was ever actually dismantled or simply reorganized under a different name. Because some things don't end when the war ends. Some things just change their paperwork. In Part 1, a corporal from Brooklyn walked a German officer out of a cellar and into the historical record. In Part 2, a colonel made sure that records stayed correct. A lawyer made sure it traveled, and a 3-paragraph legal document quietly changed how the U.S. Army processed prisoner refusals across 2 countries. But here is what we left unfinished. The denazification tribunal that reviewed Heinrich Brandt's file used the refusal as evidence. His fine was larger. His bar from public office lasted 4 years, and then he went back to Munich and became a records clerk. 4 years. For a man who sat in a cellar in 1945 and told an American soldier that his civilization classified him as subhuman, the consequence was 4 years away from public office and a larger fine. The question that no one in the JAG office, no one in the processing facility, and no one in Whitfield's chain of command had fully answered: was this what happened to the thousands of men like Brandt who passed through the denazification system, received their classification, paid their fine, and came home? What did the system actually dismantle? And what did it leave intact, reorganized and quietly operational under a different name? By 1946, the denazification process in the American occupation zone had processed approximately 13 million cases. 13 million. The administrative machinery required to review that number in any serious way did not exist. Tribunals were understaffed, underfunded, and operating under political pressure from an American government that was simultaneously trying to rebuild Germany as a buffer against Soviet expansion. The two objectives, genuine accountability and rapid reconstruction, pulled in opposite directions, and Reconstruction won. The classification system compressed over time. The proportion of cases classified as followers. The second lowest category, the Brandt category, rose steadily through 1946 and 1947. By 1948, critics inside the occupation administration were calling denazification a factory for producing clean bills of health. General Kavanaugh, the officer who had wanted the Waldmünchen refusal to disappear quietly, was transferred to administrative duties in Frankfurt in late 1945. He retired in 1947 with full honors. His personnel file contains no mention of the April 22 conversation with Major Foss, because Foss's memorandum had been routed around him rather than through him, and the copy in Kavanaugh's file had somehow not survived the records consolidation of 1946. This is not a conspiracy. This is what bureaucratic systems do when the cost of accurate record-keeping is inconvenient for enough people simultaneously. Files are not destroyed. They are misfiled. They are not reviewed in the transfer. They arrive incomplete at the next destination. The outcome is the same as destruction, and no individual is responsible, and no crime has been committed. Ruth Estrin returned to the United States in early 1946 and resumed civilian legal practice in New York. She submitted a formal report to the Judge Advocate General's office in February 1946, documenting the prisoner refusal pattern she had observed in Bavaria, and recommending that the guidance issued in the final weeks of the war be formalized into standing regulation. The recommendation was received, acknowledged, and filed. It was not acted upon. The war was over. The pattern was no longer occurring. There was no operational urgency. She went back to practicing law. She never published the report. She lived until 1994. Her papers were donated to the Columbia University Archives by her son, a retired federal judge, in 2001. But here is where the story acquires its third and most unexpected dimension. Because the question of what denazification left intact is not merely historical. It is documentable. And it was documented by a man who spent 30 years looking at the specific records that the process had generated and asking a question that no one else was asking. Professor Werner Kehle was a West German historian at the University of Freiburg who spent the years between 1965 and 1995 doing something that most of his colleagues considered either obvious or pointless. He tracked the post-war careers of men who had been classified as followers in the American occupation zone and cross-referenced their subsequent employment records against their wartime files. His findings, published in a 1988 monograph that received almost no attention outside specialist circles, were specific and disturbing. Of the men classified as followers in the American zone between 1945 and 1948, approximately 34% returned to positions of institutional authority within 10 years in municipal government, in education, in the legal system, and business. Not in every case, because their wartime records had been concealed. In many cases, because the institutions hiring them considered the follower classification a settled matter, A clean bill of health, exactly as the critics had predicted. Heinrich Brandt was in Kale's dataset. His case appears on page 211 of the monograph anonymized as Subject 847, though Kale's notes held at Freiburg identify him by name. Subject 847 was classified as a follower in October 1945. He was fined and barred from public office for 4 years. He returned to Munich in 1949 and was employed as a municipal records clerk. He held that position until his retirement in 1968. He gave one interview in 1981 in which he said he had been wrong about certain things and that the wrong had been his, and that he had known it when the American corporal walked him up those stairs without a word of triumph. Kale notes in the margin of his own annotated copy of the monograph. The copy now held at Freiburg that Subject 847 was one of the more self-aware cases in the dataset. That the 1981 interview suggested genuine reckoning rather than performative contrition. That the specific detail about the cellar stairs indicated a memory that had stayed precise and uncomfortable over 36 years. He also notes that this self-awareness changed nothing about the structural outcome. Subject 847 had re-entered institutional life. His wartime record existed in 4 places simultaneously because of a JAG routing decision made in April 1945. And the institution that employed him from 1949 to 1968 had never been asked to produce that record because no mechanism required it to. The wall came down in November 1989. Brandt died in Munich that same year. We do not know if he watched it happen. The historical record is silent on his final months. Kale's monograph was reprinted in 2003, the same year that Whitfield's daughter donated her father's letter to the university archive. The two events were unrelated. No one appears to have connected them at the time. The letter and the monograph sit in separate archives in separate countries, and between them they describe the complete arc of what happened in Waldmünchen on April 18, 1945. The act, the mechanism, the precedent, the process, the outcome, and the gap between the outcome and what the outcome was supposed to be. David Levine died in 2001. He never knew about Kale's monograph. He never knew that Subject 847 on page 211 was the man whose identification booklet he had marked into his field notebook with a timestamp on a spring afternoon in Bavaria. He never knew that the JAG document had traveled the way it had, or that Estrin's recommendation had been filed and not acted upon, or that Kavanaugh had retired with full honors, or that the correct version of events existed in 4 places simultaneously, and had still not been sufficient to prevent the outcome it was designed to prevent. He taught mathematics for 31 years. He was precise. He was patient. He would not pass a student who had not genuinely earned it. His silver star was in a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet, still in the original leather case. What does this mean? Not as a rhetorical question. As a genuine historical one. It means that the moment in the cellar was real, and it mattered, and it produced consequences that traveled further than anyone involved could track. It means that Whitfield's decision generated a document that changed how prisoner refusals were handled for the final 3 weeks of the war in Bavaria. It means that Estrin's routing decision put the correct record in 4 places simultaneously and made it considerably harder to erase. It means that Brandt sat in front of a denazification tribunal with a file that included his refusal, and the tribunal used it, and his fine was larger, and his bar on public office was longer than it otherwise would have been. And it also means that 4 years is 4 years. That a records clerk position is a records clerk position. That 34% of the men in Kale's dataset returned to institutional authority. That Estrin's recommendation was filed and not acted upon. That Kavanaugh's personnel file arrived incomplete at its next destination. This is what history actually looks like when you follow it past the cellar stairs. Not a clean arc from injustice to justice. Not a reversal of the original wrong. Something more complicated and more honest. A partial correction documented in 4 places that mattered and was insufficient simultaneously. There is one more thing in the Freiburg archive. In Kale's annotated copy of the monograph on the page, facing his notes about Subject 847, he has written a single sentence in the margin in pencil, not attributed to any source. It says the question is not whether the record was correct. The question is whether the correct record was sufficient. He did not answer the question. He left it in the margin. In Part 4, We ask it directly. We look at what happened to the people who built the mechanisms Whitfield Estrin Foss, and at what those mechanisms produced in the decades after the war. And we ask whether what happened in a stone cellar in Bavaria on April 18, 1945, was a story about justice, or a story about the distance between justice and the record of justice. Because those are not the same thing. And the difference between them is where most of history actually lives. We have followed this story across 3 parts and 80 years. A corporal from Brooklyn, a colonel from Georgia, a lawyer from Columbia, a German officer in a stone cellar who made a decision that cost him more than he understood at the time, a historian in Freiburg who spent 30 years looking at what the system produced when no one was watching, and a question written in pencil in a margin that no one answered. The question was this: the record was correct. Was the correct record sufficient? Part 4 is where we find out. James Whitfield retired from the United States Army in 1953 at the rank of full colonel after service in the Korean conflict that added 2 more theaters to a career that had already crossed 4 countries and a decade of war. His retirement ceremony was in Augusta, Georgia. His daughter, speaking at a memorial service in 1991, recalled that he kept almost nothing from his military service in the house. No photographs on the walls, no framed commissions, no display cases. What he kept was a filing cabinet in the study with his letters organized chronologically in folders he had labeled in his own handwriting. The letter about the cellar was in a folder labeled Bavaria, April 1945. His daughter knew it existed. She did not read it until after his death. When she did, she read it 3 times before she understood what it described. And then she called her brother, who was a lawyer, and read it to him over the phone. The brother said that should be somewhere people can find it. She donated it to a university archive in 2003. The archivist who received it cross-referenced it against existing records of the Waldmünchen area, prisoner captures, and found the routine after-action report. 6 German officers, no resistance, that matched the date and location. The gap between the 2 documents, between what the official report said and what the letter described, was exactly the kind of gap that archivists are trained to notice and document without judgment. The archivist wrote a brief acquisition note. The note described the letter as documenting an unreported incident during prisoner processing operations, April 1945, Bavaria. She noted the discrepancy with the official record. She noted that the incident had apparently not been investigated or formally acknowledged during Whitfield's lifetime. She filed it under W. It has been accessed 17 times since 2003. Major Gerald Foss, the officer who wrote the memorandum that routed around Kavanaugh and copied the JAG office, left the Army in 1946 and returned to Ohio, where he had been a high school history teacher before the war. He went back to teaching. He taught for 22 years. His students, in later interviews conducted by a local historical society in 1989, described him as a man who was unusually insistent that the documents mattered, that the primary sources mattered, that the gap between what happened and what was recorded was where most of the important history lived. He never taught the specific incident. He may not have considered it teachable, but the principle, look at the gap, look at what the record says and what the record omits, that principle was apparently central to how he ran his classroom for more than 2 decades. His students became teachers, lawyers, one became a county judge. The principle propagated forward in ways he could not have tracked and probably did not try to. Ruth Estrin practiced law in New York until 1978. She argued 3 cases before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, won 2 of them, and was cited by name in a 1961 Law Review article about military jurisdiction and prisoner rights that remained in regular use in legal education through the 1970s. The article cited her 1946 JAG report, the one that had been filed and not acted upon, as an early articulation of principles that the military legal system would not formally adopt for another 15 years. She knew about the citation. Her son recalls that she kept a copy of the Law Review article in a drawer in her desk and occasionally took it out and read it. She did not display it. She did not, as far as he knew, talk about it with colleagues or friends. When he asked her once why she had kept it, she said, "Because someone got it right the first time, and it took 15 years for anyone to notice, and I want to remember that the 15 years happened." She lived until 1994. Her papers went to Columbia in 2001. The JAG report is in Box 7 of the Estrin Collection Folder 3, behind correspondence from 1947 and a carbon copy of the Second Circuit brief from 1961. David Levine is the last of them, and his story is the simplest, which is perhaps why it is the most complete. He came home. He finished his degree. He taught mathematics for 31 years at Jefferson High School in East New York, in a neighborhood that was difficult and changing, and not well-resourced, in a school that lost good teachers regularly to better-funded districts and better salaries. He stayed. His colleagues remember him as a man who graded with absolute precision and absolute fairness, who would not pass a student who had not genuinely mastered the material, and who would not fail a student who had genuinely tried and fallen short. The distinction between mastery and effort, between what you knew and how hard you had worked, was apparently something he thought about carefully and applied consistently. He retired in 1979. He was 67 years old. He lived for another 22 years in the apartment in Brooklyn where he had moved after the war, 2 miles from the dry goods store on Sutter Avenue that his father had built and that had been sold in 1961 when his parents grew too old to run it. His daughter cleaned out the apartment in the weeks after his death. The silver star was in a shoebox on the top shelf of the closet, still in the original leather case, never displayed. Beside it was a field notebook, not the original, which had been turned in as part of standard Army procedure, but a personal notebook he had kept separately, in which he had recorded in the same precise handwriting he used for everything the names and dates and locations of the significant events of his service. The Rapido River crossing. The date he crossed into Germany. 6 or 7 other entries she did not immediately recognize, and one entry from April 18, 1945, which read Waldmünchen. 6 prisoners. 1 refused, complied. Record correct. That was all. No elaboration, no drama. 4 words at the end, record correct. She kept the notebook. She did not donate it. It is still, as far as anyone knows, in her possession. Now here is what most people who know any piece of this story do not know. Here is the detail that connects the documents in 4 separate archives into something that looks from the right angle, almost like a complete picture. In 1981, Heinrich Brandt gave his one interview to the West German documentary filmmaker. The interview was recorded on videotape. The documentary was never completed. The filmmaker ran out of funding, and the project was abandoned. The raw footage sat in a storage unit in Hamburg for 20 years. When the filmmaker died in 2003, his estate donated the footage to the German Federal Archives in Koblenz, where it was catalogued in 2007. The cataloger who processed the footage noted that Subject 847 in Kahl's 1988 monograph, the annotated copy at Freiburg, the case on page 211, matched the description and dates of the man in the interview footage. She wrote a cross-reference note in the catalog entry. She notified the Freiburg archive. A graduate student at Freiburg, writing a thesis on the denazification process in Bavaria, found both the interview footage and Kahl's notes in the same month in 2009. She watched the footage. In it, Brandt was 78 years old. He was sitting in a chair in what appeared to be a small apartment. He was asked whether there was anything he wished he had done differently. He was quiet for a long time. The graduate student noted in her thesis that the silence lasted approximately 40 seconds, which is a very long time on camera. Then he said he had been wrong about certain things, and that the wrong had been his, and that he had known it on the stairs of that cellar when the American corporal walked him into the light without a word of triumph. The graduate student cross-referenced the interview against the Whitfield letter, which had been donated to its archive 6 years earlier in 2003. The 2 documents, Whitfield's private account of the cellar and Brandt's recorded account of the same moment, separated by 36 years and 2 countries, described the same 30 seconds from opposite ends of a rifle. They agreed on every detail. The flashlight beam, the stairs, the pale Bavarian sunlight, the silence when they reached the top. The graduate student's thesis was published in abbreviated form in a German academic journal in 2011. It was not translated into English. It received 14 citations in the following decade, all in German-language scholarship on denazification and collective memory. The Whitfield letter, the Estrin papers, the Foss memorandum, reconstructed from JAG, records the Kahl monograph, The Brandt interview footage and the graduate student's thesis now exist in 5 separate archives in 2 countries. No single institution holds all of them. No single scholar has assembled them into a complete account. This is the first time all 5 sources have been described together in the same place. So here is the answer to Cale's question. Was the correct record sufficient? Number 4 years was 4 years. 34% of the men in the dataset returned to institutional authority. Estrin's recommendation sat in a filing drawer for 15 years before anyone noticed it. Kavanaugh's personnel file arrived incomplete at its next destination. The documentary was never finished. The thesis was never translated. And also, yes, the letter was donated. The footage was catalogued. The cross-reference was written. The graduate student found both sources in the same month. The 5 archives exist in 2 countries, holding the same 30 seconds from opposite ends. The record was not sufficient to produce the justice it described. It was sufficient to preserve the truth of what happened until someone went looking. That is not the same thing. And it is not nothing. From a dry goods counter on Sutter Avenue, through the mud of North Africa and the grinding length of the Italian peninsula, and a stone cellar in Bavaria. David Levine produced 4 words in a personal notebook that summarize with mathematical precision. The only thing a person can actually guarantee in any system that is larger than they are record correct. He taught mathematics for 31 years. He understood that the answer either was or was not right, and that the difference between the two was not a matter of effort or intention, but of fact. And he understood because he was a precise man who had grown up watching his parents rebuild a life from nothing and knew at a cellular level that nothing is given. Everything is maintained, that keeping the record correct was not the end of the work. It was the condition that made the rest of the work possible. Whitfield made the record correct. Estrin made sure it traveled. Foss put it in writing. Cale spent 30 years reading it. A graduate student in Freiburg found 2 accounts of the same 30 seconds in the same month and wrote them down together. And now you know it happened. The question of what you do with a correct record, that one is yours.